Scripture reading this morning will be taken from Acts chapter 7. It's Acts chapter 7, verses 30 through 34. And when 40 years had passed, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire in a bush in the wilderness of Mount Sinai. When Moses saw it, he marveled at the sight, and as he drew near to observe, the voice of the Lord came to him, saying, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses trembled and dared not look. Then the Lord said to him, Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their groaning, and I have come down to deliver them. And now come, I will send you to Egypt.
Well, good morning. Certainly a great morning to be worshiping our God together, and we'll continue to do that as we open our Bibles together. If you would, go ahead and open your Bibles to Exodus chapter 3. We'll be in Exodus 3 in just a moment. I want to wish those who are visiting with us a warm welcome. We are certainly thankful that you are here and grateful for the opportunity to worship our God together. If you have questions about the things that we do or the things that are taught as part of our worship and our lessons, we encourage you to talk to us afterwards. I really want to thank Scott for the series that he's been doing recently on dealing with doubts through the morning and the evening services. There have just been some really good conversations and lessons that have come from really the questions that you all have had. We sent out a link to a Google form about a month and a half ago asking, what are some of the doubts you have when it comes to matters of faith? And we've gotten lots of responses there, and we've tried to go through those pretty systematically and touch on a lot of the things that were brought up. And so for everybody who filled out that form, who have talked to us one-on-one, thank you for doing that. Any time you have questions about things of the Bible, we want to be teaching those things. We want to be talking about those things. And that's where this lesson comes from this morning, where the series that Scott just left off on was dealing with doubts around the ideas of theology, about the teachings of who God is and what he's like, the doctrine of Christ, and even the apologetics and the evidences, those reasons for why we believe what we believe. There was actually a subset of things that came into this form that weren't so much about doubt dealing with the faith, as it were, but doubt turned inward. Matters of faith living out in our own lives, matters of self-doubt, that brought out questions like this. Am I ever doing enough? My life is going nowhere. Am I just too late for getting on the train to where I'm supposed to be at this point in life? Did I make the right decision way back when or yesterday? How can I keep making the right decisions? How do I know I'm making the right decisions? And am I living up to God's standards? As a human, as a son or a daughter, as a mother or father, as a spouse, as an employer, an employee. You see, this is a struggle that I think we all face at one degree or another, and at varying times and at various seasons of life. We have self-doubts. And so we wrestle with these things, and we need to be mindful in all of these doubts and worries and self-criticisms. I believe the solution is a better understanding of God's grace. The scriptures encourage us, particularly at the end of the book of 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 18, that we are to grow in the grace and knowledge of Jesus. And certainly we can talk about growing in knowledge. We need to be in the book. We need to know who God is through his inspired word. And part of that means that we're going to grow in grace, in living by his grace. And it might not be the person that you would think of, but I actually want to use Moses this morning to learn a little bit more about how we can grow in grace. Dan read for us from Acts chapter 7 as Stephen is recounting the story of Moses at the burning bush when God is speaking to him there. But I want us to go back to the original account in Exodus chapter 3 and 4 and see what's going on with Moses. Because when Moses first has this conversation with God in Exodus 3, he expresses a lot of self-inadequacy. Really, we see this scene in the first thing that he says in Exodus chapter 3. If you look there in verse 11, God makes it clear. He calls to him in verse 4. He says, you're standing on holy ground. It makes clear in verse 6 that Moses is terrified. God explains who he is, that he's heard his people, and he's going to free them. And then you look at verse 11, when Moses finally says something. Moses said to God, "Who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" Really? Me, God? I'm the guy that you want? And while we can interpret that a couple different ways, as we go along in the conversation, we see a little bit more about Moses' sense of inadequacy of himself. If you jump over into chapter 4, God makes it very clear the things that he's seen, that he knows what's going on. He hasn't been absent these hundreds of years, but that it's part of his plan, and now Moses is part of fulfilling his purposes. But as he explains all this, and you get into chapter 4, Moses speaks up again in verse 1 and answers, "But behold, the people of Israel, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, 'The Lord did not appear to you.'" And so God gives him a series of signs to prove that this is supernatural, that this isn't just somebody flapping their lips, that this is somebody truly commissioned by God to be doing God's work. But then you get down to verse 10, and this is maybe where you think of Moses feeling that he's not qualified for the job. Moses said to the Lord, "Oh, my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue. I am not the person you want to be your spokesperson. I don't have the skill set necessary." God makes it clear, I made your mouth. I gave you your tongue. I know how you can speak, and I'm choosing you. In verse 13, Moses makes it very clear what he's been asking this whole time. "Oh Lord, please send someone else. It's not me." In all of these responses, I see Moses getting caught up on himself. Interpret it how you will, but he uses a lot of personal pronouns, I and me. He is caught up on himself that he can't see past himself in this conversation. God is speaking to him through a burning bush, and he's terrified, and he recognizes what's going on, but he can't get past, me. I'm not good enough. I'm struggling with my fears. What if I mess up? My failures of my past. It's holding him back. I love God's response in every single one of these instances as we've gone through, that God is continually to showering Moses with language of grace. Moses says, "Who am I?" God says, "I am." Moses says, who am I to be this spokesperson you want me to be? And God says, "I will be with you. I will be with your mouth and tell you what to say. I made your mouth, Moses." And even at the end when he says, "Just send somebody else. You really want somebody else on this? There you go. There's Aaron. You can go and meet up with him. You can have him speak for if you want. You're not getting out of this. I've chosen you." This is what Moses needs to get up and get going, to be the person God has called him to be. God even gives him signs, these miracles to perform, that he can see and practice there right next to the burning bush. He's trying to build up his confidence to see that this is not about you, Moses. It's about God. How often we can fall into that as well. In our self-doubts and our worries and concerns and self-criticisms, that we get so caught up in ourselves that we can't see past our own perspectives of things, to see where God's hand is at work in our lives, where he's calling us to greater faith and love and service, to a greater knowledge and trust and contentment in him. What I love about this story, and if you turn to Acts 7, where it was read for us in a moment, how do you picture Moses in your mind's eye when this conversation is going on? For me, it's like Prince of Egypt. That was like a movie that I loved, and I picture Moses as like some 30 or 40-year-old guy. He's 80 years old. Even for Bible times, that's up there. Moses himself writes later in a psalm, we've got about 70, or by reason of strength, 80 years of life. Says the guy who's going to live to be 120. But you appreciate this. From what we know in Acts chapter 7, as Stephen retells his story, you look at verse 23, how old is he when he even gets up and goes out to visit his people as he's still a prince in Egypt? When he was 40 years old, he decides, I'm going to visit my brothers, the children of Israel. That's when he sees the oppression. That's when he stands up. That's when he ultimately realizes he needs to flee. So the first 40 years of his life, he's living in Egypt. The next 40 years, 40 through 80, he's in Midian, serving as a shepherd, his father-in-law Jethro. So it's 40 years later, as it says in verse 30, when 40 years had passed, that's when he encounters the burning bush. You see, for a lot of 80-year-olds, they'd say, oh, I'm coming in for a landing. Just kind of going through, I'm just going to spend the rest of my life shepherding out here. But when we read the story, you know why I think we picture Moses a little bit younger, even when we might know these facts? It's because for us, the story's just getting started. Moses, you got so much stuff that we know you're going to do because we're reading the story after the fact. But you see, we don't get to read our own stories after the fact. We're living them in the moment. And we say, well, I'm done. I've screwed up too much. This is just kind of where I am. I'm just coasting. And God's knocking on the door of our heart saying, I've got big things for you. Whether you're 15, whether you're 50, whether you're 80. So while we might be tempted to say, I'm too old, I'm too late to the party, I've made too many mistakes, we need to trust in God's timing and his purposes, that we are not done because he is active in our lives. In whatever season we are in, we need to take Colossians chapter 1 and verse 12 to heart, where it makes clear that we do not earn our credentials to be good enough to serve God. Like Moses is saying, I'm not qualified. Here's all the reasons you need to pick somebody else. God is the one who qualifies you. He's the one who picked Moses, and he's put you where he wants you in the body, just as he desired. You're around the people that you're around. You're hearing the things that you're hearing for such a time as this. In Colossians 1 and verse 12, it says that we need to be giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. Did he say you met the resume qualifications to be good enough to get into the family? No. He qualified you. He makes you good enough. You can turn me down a little bit, man. I'm getting heated up over here. I love talking about this. And so Moses begins this journey of faith, as we would think of it, at 80 years old. Despite these initial hesitancies that we read about in Exodus 3 and 4, he goes out and he serves God. And as we read about later in the New Testament, his focus needs to be our focus. If we are going to grow in grace, if we're going to trust in God's grace to get us to where he wants us to be and where we need to be, that is closer to God, we do well to take a note from what the Hebrews writer in chapter 11 says about the faith of Moses, beginning in verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. By faith, by faith, by faith. Why? Because Moses was focused on God. This is the beginning of him growing in grace. And it's how we are going to grow in grace. If we are doing things by faith, trusting in Jesus, looking to Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. Not trusting in my own strength or my own good enoughs or my own credentials, but in putting all that to the feet of the Lord and saying, use this how you will, God. But if you know the story of Moses, you know that it doesn't get easier necessarily. In fact, Moses continues to face difficulties. If you turn back into the Old Testament, we'll pick up in Numbers 11, where Moses, in one of these instances, and there's certainly others we could look at, but Moses hits this point that I think a lot of us hit, where we just say, I can't do it. I've hit a wall. Have you felt that before? Do you feel that this morning? Just hit a wall. I don't know what I'm doing. I can't go on. Moses faces this as well. In Numbers 11, beginning in verse 10 for context, we understand here that the people are complaining, as there's a pattern of when they're wandering in the wilderness after they've left Sinai. And Moses is kind of the brunt of them complaining. We're hungry, we want food, feed us. And there's this immense amount of people clamoring for something to eat. And Moses just gets overwhelmed to the point that he says this to God. Beginning in verse 10 of Numbers 11, Moses heard the people weeping throughout their clans, everyone at the door of his tent, and the anger of the Lord blazed hotly, and Moses was displeased. Moses said to the Lord, "Why have you dealt ill with your servant? And why have I not found favor in your sight that you lay the burden of all this people on me? Did I conceive all this people? Did I give birth to them that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries a nursing child to the land that you swore to give their fathers? Where am I to get meat to give all these people? For they weep before me and say, give us meat that we may eat. I am not able to carry all this people alone. The burden is too heavy for me. If you will treat me like this, kill me at once, if I find favor in your sight, that I might not see my wretchedness." I feel like you could copy-paste that last piece of what Moses said into a lot of our minds. We might not say those things out loud, but we feel wretched. We feel not good enough. We feel like, I can't do this. And so, the task in front of Moses wore on him. What's fascinating is if we go back to a place like Exodus 18, something similar was happening, but Moses didn't even realize it at the time. So you remember Numbers 11, keep that in mind, and then you go back to Exodus 18, where they've come out of Egypt, they're going to Sinai, and they run into Moses' father Jethro, and he kind of is seeing all the amazing things that God has done, and he's kind of watching Moses and what he's doing with the people. Beginning in verse 13 of Exodus 18, the next day Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood around Moses from morning till evening. When Moses' father-in-law saw all that he was doing for the people, he said, "What is this that you are doing for the people? Why do you sit alone, and all the people stand around you from morning till evening?" And Moses said to his father-in-law, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, they come to me, and I decide between one person and another, and I make them know the statutes of God and his laws." Moses' father-in-law said to him, "What you are doing is not good. You and the people with you will certainly wear yourselves out, for the thing is too heavy for you. You are not able to do it alone." Jethro goes on and gives them some advice. You need to delegate. You need to have some trustworthy people come along and help deal with these smaller matters, and then the big stuff can work its way up to you. I want you to notice from these two examples that life certainly overwhelms Moses. Life can overwhelm us. And while he might not have realized it in Exodus 18 that he was going to run himself ragged doing this, he certainly feels it by the time the people are clamoring for meat in Numbers chapter 11. And maybe it's a matter of we feel like I'm failing to meet expectations. Whether it's the expectations of the people saying, give us meat, we might feel like there are expectations other people put on us that I just can't meet them all. Maybe it's expectations you're putting on yourself. Moses is saying, I've got to be the one sitting here, giving the judgment, sharing this law of God. And Jethro says, there's a better way to do this, where you're not going to wear yourself out so much. This is too heavy for you. In any case, when we realize that we are unable, this should not lead us to despair, though it's really easy to get down that path of thinking. When we come to a point and we are saying, I am not able, we need to hear the voice of God saying, I am able. Moses, it's not your job to feed this people. You're not going to be the one to do this. It's God. It always has been God, and it will continue to be God who guides this people, who corrects his people, who provides for his people. We need to have that same lesson in our hearts. That when I think I'm not able, God says, I am able. And I will give you the strength to do what you need to do to live faithfully for me. I will put it in your hands, and I will put it in your mind what you need when you're following and focused on me. This is amazing when we consider God's grace. God's grace is something that we cannot take for granted, and it's something that should constantly be reminding us day in and day out as we consider this unearned favor that God has toward us, that our sufficiency doesn't come from us, but it comes from God. That is the lesson of 2 Corinthians. If you turn over in your New Testament now to 2 Corinthians chapter 3 in the first 6 verses. To give a little scene setting here, Paul is talking about these other so-called super apostles and different people who are coming along trying to teach and doing it for recognition. And he's saying, we're not, the real apostles like Paul and others are not trying to do this for self-recognition. He's not trying to work his way up any sort of structure or social ladder of getting enough, sense of self-importance. Paul's saying my sufficiency, my being good enough, my sense of self-worth comes from God. 2 Corinthians 3 and verse 1 says this when it says, are we beginning to commend ourselves again? Or do we need, as some do, letters of recommendation to you or from you? You yourselves are our letter of recommendation, written on our hearts to be known and read by all. And you show that you are a letter from Christ delivered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. Such is the confidence that we have through Christ toward God. Not that we are sufficient in ourselves to claim anything as coming from us, but our sufficiency is from God, who has made us sufficient to be ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Paul's saying, I'm not saying I've earned a place as an apostle or a minister. It says here that God has made us sufficient to be ministers. And so when you say, I'm not able to do this parenting thing, God says, I'm going to make you sufficient. When you trust me to be your teacher of how to be a parent, I'll make you sufficient. God, I don't know if I'm able to keep myself pure and unstained from the world. And God says, I'll make you sufficient. When your heart is fully given over into my hands, to let my word shape your mind, to guide you where you need to be. It's God's grace that makes us sufficient, so that when we do go out and step forward, that we are acting in grace, that we're not earning anything, certainly not our salvation, and we're not earning anything else by our good works, but it's actually God's grace that fuels us doing the things we need to do. A few pages back in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 10, Paul simply says this. He talks about Jesus appearing to the apostles after he's been raised. He appears to all the apostles. In verse 8, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me, for I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. You see, Paul's not saying I'm working harder because I've picked myself up by my bootstraps. He's saying God's grace has inspired me to serve him with my whole heart, and that's what's pushing me forward. That's what needs to push us forward, to excel still the more, to grow in our service, in our love, in our good works. Not because we feel like we got to meet checklists, not because I got to do enough to be on God's good side, but because he showers his grace on me, because he looks at me as his favored child, that even when I mess up, that he loves me more than all my mistakes. And he calls me to greater love and faithfulness, so that we, like Paul, can do our work, not because we feel like we need to get good enough or earn it, but because we are living a life in loud proclamation of how good our God is to us. Because we are not able, a lot of the times, to do the things that we set our minds to do or that God might call us to do by our own strength. But God says, I am able, and I will carry you. I will give you the strength to trust in me. When you get to the end of Moses' life, it's interesting because his story ends in a way that maybe we wouldn't like. If it was us, certainly we wouldn't like. But we need some context. So back in Numbers chapter 20, we need to understand what God's going to speak to him at the end. There's another point in time when in their wanderings, the people are asking for water, and God's giving instruction here of how Moses is going to provide water from God's power. Numbers 20 and verse 7, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them and give drink to the congregation and their cattle. And Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly. And the congregation drank and their livestock. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe in me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. These are the waters of Meribah, where the people of Israel quarreled with the Lord, and through them he showed himself holy. God said, speak to the rock. Yeah, but God, you told me to strike the rock last time. It doesn't matter. I'm telling you now, speak to the rock. Moses hits it twice. Water still comes out. Hey, the ends justify the means. There are consequences. God tells Moses, you are not going to enter into this land. This whole time you've been leading this people to this goal, and you're not going to enter in yourself. And so we might ask this question, is this the end for Moses? Is this where he's landing the plane and just kind of settled into mundane, good enough? I want you to go to the end of the book of Deuteronomy, the end of the books of Moses, and look in chapter 34. Moses is 120 years old, so 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in Midian, 40 years leading the people out and wandering in the wilderness. He comes to be 120 years old. God says, I'll let you look at Canaan. I'll let you get up on Mount Pisgah and see the promised land, but I meant what I said back there in Numbers 20. You are not going to go in. Our sins have consequences, and they're in this life. But the question for Moses is, was this the loss of all hope? Let's read in Deuteronomy chapter 34, verses 1 through 8. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land, Gilead as far as Dan, all Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negeb and the plain that is the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees as far as Zoar. And the Lord said to him, this is the land of which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, I will give it to your offspring. I've let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But no one knows the place of his burial to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was undimmed, and his vigor unabated. And the people of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. And then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. It's fascinating to see that even at the end, Moses did not slow down at 120 years old. It says his eyes were undimmed. He still saw clearly. And his natural energy, his physical health was unabated. He kept going. He kept striving. Yes, even after the mistake at the waters of Meribah, even after he directly disobeyed God, even after these severe consequences that were not going to let him enter into this promised land. He kept serving God because God is good. Because God's grace was still showing him how he could grow. And if you have any doubt of where Moses is now, may I point you to the New Testament in Luke chapter 9. Because we know, actually, that God's grace gets us there. It's true of Moses, and it's true of you and me. Despite this mistake, despite the physical consequences of Moses not entering the physical promised land, Moses does enter the spiritual promised land. And we know this from Jesus' transfiguration of the Sermon on the Mount. In Luke chapter 9, 28 through 31, Jesus has a conversation with, of all people, Moses and Elijah. We won't read the whole thing, but I'll just draw your attention to verse 30. Behold, two men were talking with Jesus, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. That word departure there is Exodus. So it might have had a little special resonance, at least talking with Moses and leading the people out. I hope that you see, as we deal with our self-doubts and our worries and our past mistakes, that we cannot let these things weigh us down. It's easy to fall into the trap and focus on the past or my own self-concerns. But when we lift up our eyes and focus on God and his lavish grace upon us, it inspires us to live for him, to look past ourselves and to see the needs around us, to see the opportunities around us, and to have our eyes undimmed and our spirits unabated. It is by his grace and through your faith that the disciple of Jesus gains victory to the end. I leave you with 1 John chapter 3 as a way of encouragement to bring all these points home. A lot of these self-doubts that we've addressed this morning come from our hearts. The Bible has a lot to say about the heart, some good things and some things where it can be led astray and be corrupted by lies. 1 John chapter 3 gives us some confidence when we look at verses 18 through 24 about how we see our self-talk that happens in our hearts in relationship to how we compare that to what God is saying about us through his word. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 18, little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. By this we shall know that we are of the truth and reassure our heart before him. For whenever our heart condemns us, God is greater than our heart, and he knows everything. Beloved, if our heart does not condemn us, we have confidence before God. And whatever we ask, we receive from him because we keep his commandments and do what pleases him. And this is his commandment, that we believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another just as he has commanded us. Whoever keeps his commandments abides in God, and God in him. And by this we know that he abides in us, by the Spirit whom he has given us. This confidence that we're talking about, that comes with growing in the grace of God, stems from abiding in him, by keeping his commandments, by walking in his ways, by doing what pleases our Creator. And we can have confidence because God shows us in his word what that is. My encouragement for you this morning, even if your eyesight is terrible, I want the eyes of your heart to be undimmed, to see the spiritual truth of your life and the circumstances and your God, that you would see clearly. And my prayer for you is that your spiritual strength, even if you can't do all the things you used to be able to do, that your spiritual strength would be unabated. Because you're not resting in the power of yourself or of your own good enoughs, that you're resting in the grace of God. And it's there that you stand and it's there that you seek to grow in that grace. Moses is just one story we could have looked at, and we just looked at a few parts that talk about the grace of God and how it helps when we are dealing with self-doubts. And if you had specific questions about some of those self-doubts that we started the conversation with, we'll be looking at some of those more in detail as we go forward. But I hope this is at least a starting point for so many of us to understand that God's grace is enough. He's the one who makes us good enough. He qualifies us. And he's calling you to greater service and faithfulness, not so you can earn anything, but because you are his child and you have that confidence in him. So have you tasted that grace this morning? It's really nice to read about, but it's so much better to live in it. In fact, it changes your life. It transforms who you are because you're not living for yourself anymore. You are living for God and his awesome purposes, the purposes that are better any you could come up for yourself. If you doubt his grace, it's what makes salvation a reality. God's grace is what sent Jesus to this earth so that he could die in our place, so that we would just have the chance to respond, to be his, to say, I am coming, Lord. If you're here this morning and you recognize that you have some of this self-doubt in your internal conversation with yourself, I encourage you to learn from Moses and learn from the teachings of the scriptures, that we all go through this, that we can come alongside each other and encourage each other, but we need to listen to the voice of God when he says, I will be with you. I am able. And if your heart condemns you, but you're focused on me and striving to serve me, I'm greater than your heart. The question is, will you put your heart in God's hands this morning? Will you give your whole heart to him? And if you're not a Christian, you haven't made that decision, now is an awesome opportunity. The opportunity is always available to you. But how wonderful it would be to make the choice right now, if you know what you need to do, to come home to the Father, as Elliot talked about at the table, that the Father is just watching and waiting for you. And the moment you turn to him, he will run to you with open arms and welcome you into his fold. If you need to obey the gospel this morning, to repent of the sins that you have committed, to be born again by being washed in the waters of baptism so that you can be buried with Jesus and raised to newness of life, that opportunity is here for you right now. So as we sing this song, I want you to think about where you stand with God, about his awesome grace toward you, and how you can respond to him. And if we can help you respond in any way, we want you to let us know while